Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. The topic of this program is using modifiers correctly. I like to compare a sentence to a machine. Now, every machine has a purpose: to dig holes, to produce goods, to transport passengers. The purpose of a sentence is to convey meaning from one person to another. Now, like most machines, a sentence is made up of various parts. They're called the parts of speech. Nouns, pronouns, and verbs are three of the most important parts of speech. Think of them as crucial parts of the machine, like the engine and transmission in your car. In this program, we're going to look at a different part of the sentence. Our topic is modifiers. These are words or groups of words that add information about the nouns, pronouns, and verbs of the sentence. Modifiers give a special spin to the sentence. They add color, vividness, and interest. Think of modifiers as being like the chrome trim, the tinted windshield, and the CD player in your car. They aren't as important as the engine or the transmission, but they make the car a lot more fun to drive. In this program, we'll look at some of the basic principles for using modifiers correctly in the sentences you write. Are you ready? Then let's get started. A modifier gives more information about something else in the sentence. We call it a modifier because it modifies, that is, changes what we know about something else in the sentence. It gives more information or tells us something more about another item in the sentence. Now, the two most important kinds of modifiers are adjectives and adverbs. And in this lesson, we'll look at some of the basic principles for using adjectives and adverbs correctly. First, an adjective modifies a noun or pronoun. As you know, a noun names a person, place, thing, or idea, and a pronoun can take the place of a noun. An adjective would be a word that modifies or gives more information about a noun or pronoun appearing in the sentence. Take a look at this phrase, a diligent worker. In this phrase, worker is a noun. It names a person. Diligent is an adjective. It gives more information about the noun worker. It tells us what kind of worker, a diligent worker. That is, a worker who works hard. So the word diligent is an adjective because it modifies or gives more information about the noun worker. By contrast, an adverb modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. As you can see, an adverb is also a modifier, just as an adjective is, but an adverb can be used in one of three different ways. It can modify a verb, or an adjective, or another adverb. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's a short sentence. She works diligently. When you analyze a sentence, it's usually best to begin by looking for the verb, the single most important word in the sentence. What's the verb here? The verb is works. What's the subject of the verb works? Who or what is doing the working? The answer is the pronoun she. Now, what about the word diligently? What role does that play in the sentence? Well, diligently is an adverb because it gives more information about or modifies the verb works. It tells us how she works diligently. Since diligently modifies or gives more information about a verb, it's an adverb. Here's another sentence. She is very diligent. Here we have a sentence with a slightly different structure. The verb in this sentence is. The subject is the pronoun she. Now, the difference between the verb is and the verb works is the following. Works is an action verb. An action verb describes something that the subject does. Is a linking verb. A linking verb describes something that the subject is. So in this case, we have a sentence containing a linking verb rather than an action verb. Notice that what follows the linking verb is the adjective diligent. That adjective diligent refers back to, describes, or modifies the subject of the sentence, the pronoun she. It tells us something more about she. She is diligent. And that leaves the word very. What role does very play in this particular sentence? Well, very is an adverb which modifies or gives more information about the adjective diligent. How diligent is she? Very diligent. So very gives us more information about the adjective diligent. Therefore, very is an adverb, because remember, another one of the roles that an adverb can play is to modify or give more information about an adjective. And that's what very is doing in this sentence. Finally, look at this sentence. She works extremely diligently. What's the verb? Works. The subject? The pronoun she. And again, we have an action verb. This sentence describes something that she does rather than something that she is. Now we have the adverb diligently, which modifies the verb works. It tells us how she works. How? Diligently. And we have one more word, extremely. What role does extremely play in the sentence? Well, extremely is an adverb. And what does it modify? In this case, it modifies another adverb. It modifies diligently. How diligently does she work? Extremely diligently. So extremely gives us more information about or modifies the adverb diligently. So in this case, we have an adverb being used to modify another adverb. So we've seen examples now of all three ways that an adverb can be used: to modify a verb, to modify an adjective, or to modify another adverb. Notice that the adverbs extremely and diligently both happen to end in the letters ly. That's rather common in English. Not all adverbs end in ly, but many do. So when you're looking at a word in English that ends in ly, if you aren't certain what part of speech it is, consider whether or not it's an adverb. Chances are good that it is. Now, in some sentences in English, it can be a little tricky to figure out whether to use an adjective or an adverb. Here are a couple of rules that will make it easier. First, after an action verb, use an adverb. Remember that an action verb describes something that the subject does. Normally, after an action verb, an adverb should be used. We've already seen an example of this. She works diligently. Here we have the action verb works describing something that the subject, she, does. And diligently is an adverb which modifies the action verb works. It tells us how she works, gives more information about the verb, and therefore the adverb diligently is perfectly correct. After a linking verb, use an adjective. Remember that a linking verb expresses a state of being. It tells us something that the subject is, rather than something that the subject does. Take a look at this sentence. She is diligent. Here we have a sentence containing the linking verb is. The subject is she, and what follows the linking verb correctly is an adjective, not an adverb. She is diligent. That adjective diligent refers back to or modifies the pronoun she. It tells us what she is, and therefore an adjective is correctly used in this sentence. Remember that an adjective is used to modify or give more information about a noun or pronoun. Since diligent refers back to the pronoun she, an adjective rather than an adverb is correct. So in a sentence that contains a linking verb, you generally want to follow it with an adjective, not an adverb. Now, the most common linking verb in English is the verb to be, and is a form of the verb to be. But there are many other linking verbs in English. Looks, seems, appears, feels, sounds. All of these can be linking verbs. To determine whether or not a verb is being used as a linking verb or an action verb, stop and ask yourself, is this sentence describing something that the subject is doing, or is it rather saying something about what the subject is? If the latter is the case, then the verb is being used as a linking verb and should be followed by an adjective. So, for example, if the sentence, she is diligent, instead used one of these other linking verbs, the adjective diligent would continue to be correct. She looks diligent. That's really saying something about what she is, rather than what she does. So looks is a linking verb, and diligent, the adjective, is correct. She seems diligent. She appears diligent. She feels diligent. All of these are linking verbs. They're all describing something that she is rather than something that she does. And therefore, the adjective diligent is correctly used. Now, there are a couple of specific modifying words in English that can be tricky because of adjective and adverb confusion. And we'll take the next few moments of this lesson to explain the rules for using these words correctly. One somewhat tricky word in English is the word well. It can be used in a number of different ways. Well can be a noun, for example. It's a hole in the ground from which you get water. A wishing well, for example. Well can also be used as an interjection. That's a word that's very loosely connected to the rest of the sentence. Sometimes you'll hear people begin a sentence with the word well. They'll say something like, well, I think it'll rain later on today. In that sentence, the word well is simply being used almost as a space filler and doesn't have any particular meaning or any grammatical connection to the rest of the sentence. So well can be a noun, and it can be an interjection. In this lesson, we're not going to deal with either of those two uses of the word well. Instead, we're going to talk about how well is used as an adjective or an adverb. What makes it tricky is that when well is used as an adjective, it has a different meaning from when it's used as an adverb. Here's the explanation. When well is used as an adjective, it means healthy. When it's used as an adverb, it means in a good way. It's important to keep these two meanings separate and distinct in your mind. Here are some examples of the correct way to use the word well. The patient looks well today. What's the verb in this sentence? Looks. The subject, patient. Now, is looks in this sentence an action verb or a linking verb? Is it describing something that the patient is doing or something that the patient is? Well, if you think about it, this sentence is really describing something that the patient is. It's not telling something the patient did, but rather that the patient is or seems to be healthy. So the patient's state of being is being described, not an action that the patient is undertaking. So looks in this sentence is being used as a linking verb. What follows a linking verb should always be an adjective. And remember that the word well, when it's used as an adjective, means healthy. Is that being correctly used in this sentence? Of course. Since we're talking about a patient, it would be natural to talk about the state of health of the patient. So this sentence is perfectly correct. The patient looks well today means that the patient appears to be healthy. And that's an example of the correct use of the word well as an adjective to mean healthy. Look at this sentence. The hospital feeds its patients well. What's the verb here? Feeds. The subject, hospital. The hospital feeds. Now, is feeds a verb of action or a linking verb? Is something that the hospital does or something that the hospital is being described? Well, here what's being described is something that the hospital does. It feeds its patients well. In other words, it gives them meals that are good, nutritious, and so forth. So feeds is an action verb. And what follows an action verb should be an adjective or an adverb. Well, it should be an adverb. And in this case, the adverb well is being used correctly. Remember, the adverb well has nothing to do with health. It means in a good way. So what this sentence is saying is the hospital feeds its patients in a good way. And that's a perfectly correct and logical meaning. So the adverb well means in a good way, and it's being used correctly in this sentence. The hospital feeds its patients in a good way, meaning it gives them food that's tasty, healthful, and so forth. So well is being used to mean in a good way, and it's being used as an adverb. Don't confuse the adjective well with the adjective good. Look at this sentence. You look good in your new dress. What's the verb here? Look. The subject, the pronoun you. Now, is look a verb of action or a linking verb? In this case, look is being used as a linking verb. What's being described is not something that you are doing, but rather how you look, how you appear, how you are in the broadest sense. You are good looking. You're looking good today. So what's being described here is not some action that you're taking, but rather a state of being that you have. So look is being used as a linking verb here. And in this sentence, it's followed by the adjective good, which is perfectly correct. When I say you look good, what I'm saying is you are good. You are good looking in that dress. So the adjective good is correct. It would be incorrect to use the adjective well instead. If this sentence read, you look well in your new dress, it would seem to have a strange meaning, because remember, the adjective well means healthy. And it would sound as though I was saying you look healthy in your new dress, as though something about the dress makes you look less sick. And that's usually not the effect that dresses have. So when following a linking verb, if you want to talk about someone or something being good as opposed to healthy, the adjective good should be used, not the adjective well. It's a little tricky because the adverb well means in a good way, but remember, the adjective and the adverb well have very different meanings. Another word that's tricky in English is badly. Badly is an adverb meaning in a bad way. Use it only with an action verb. Here's an example. The accident damaged the car badly. What's the verb in this sentence? Damaged. The subject? Accident. The accident damaged. Is this an action verb or a linking verb? Well, what's being described is an action, something that the accident did rather than something the accident was. So damaged is an action verb, and what follows it should be an adverb. So the adverb badly is being used correctly in this sentence. How was the car damaged, or how did the accident damage the car? Badly, in a bad way. In other words, the damage was very serious. The car was nearly destroyed. So badly is being used correctly here as an adverb to modify the action verb damaged. Now, the mistake that people sometimes make is to use the adverb badly when the adjective bad would be correct. Look at this sentence. I feel badly about the accident. What's the verb here? Feel. The subject, the pronoun I. I feel badly. Now, is feel an action verb or a linking verb? This one may be a little tricky, but if you think about it, feel is not describing an action. It's not describing something that I'm doing. Rather, it's describing a state of being of me. I feel sad, depressed, unhappy. So the word that follows feel should really be an adjective describing how I am, because it's describing my state of being, not something I'm doing. So the correct wording of this sentence should be, I feel bad about the accident. Bad in this case is being used as sort of a synonym for unhappy, sad, or depressed. So when you're using a linking verb, it should be followed by the adjective bad, not by the adverb badly. It's a mistake that people often make in English, but it's something that you can avoid if you simply remember that a linking verb should be followed by an adjective, not by an adverb. If you can remember and practice these rules for the correct use of well, bad, and badly, you'll avoid some of the most common mistakes that people make when they're using modifiers in English. Well, do you think you've mastered these simple rules? I hope so. Turn to your study guide and you'll find that we've provided an exercise to give you a chance to practice using these rules yourself. Try your hand at the questions in the exercise, and when you're finished, come back to this program and we'll look at the questions together. In each of these sentences, a modifying word has been underlined. Your job is to decide whether the modifier is correct, and if it's incorrect, to decide what modifier ought to be used instead. Let's take a look at the first sentence. Glancing at himself in the mirror just moments before the job interview, Enrico felt well about his appearance. And the word well is underlined. You recall that the word well is one of those tricky words. It can be used as either an adjective or an adverb, and its meaning differs depending on which it's being used as. Now, in this particular sentence, how is the word well being used, as an adjective or an adverb? That depends on the verb that it's near. So let's take a close look at that verb. Enrico felt well about his appearance. What's the verb here? The verb is felt. The subject is Enrico. Enrico felt. Now, is felt being used as an action verb or a linking verb? Is it describing something that Enrico is doing, or is it describing something that Enrico is, a state of being of Enrico? There's really no action being described here. Instead, we're being told something about what Enrico is. That is, how he feels, his state of mind, his state of being. So, felt is a linking verb in this sentence. And with a linking verb, you would always use an adjective, not an adverb. Therefore, well should be used here as an adjective. And if that's the case, is it the correct word or not? Is it the correct adjective? Remember what well means when it's used as an adjective. It means healthy. So the sentence now appears to be saying Enrico felt healthy about his appearance. Does that make sense? Not really. We know what the author is really trying to say. Enrico felt good about his appearance. If you want to use an adjective with the linking verb and your intention is to convey the meaning good, then you have to use the adjective good rather than the adjective well. Well can only be used as an adjective to mean healthy. So in this case, the modifier well should be changed to good, and that would make the sentence correct. As originally written, it's incorrect. Take a look at the next example. The chef's hands moved quick as she demonstrated the proper technique for dicing onions. Here, the modifier quick is underlined. Now, is quick an adjective or an adverb? If you think about it, you can realize that quick is an adjective. The adverb with a corresponding meaning would have ly on the end. Remember, we've already seen that many adverbs in English have ly at the end. So quick would be an adjective, quickly would be an adverb. Now, is it correct to use an adjective or an adverb in this particular part of the sentence? What is it modifying? Well, it's modifying the verb moved. It's telling how the chef's hands moved. And is moved an action verb or a linking verb? Is it describing an action or a state of being? Well, clearly the verb moved is describing an action. You can see her hands moving just by imagining what's going on when you read this sentence. So moved is an action verb, and therefore it should be followed by an adverb, not an adjective. So the modifier quick is incorrect. Instead of the adjective quick, we want the adverb quickly, and that would make this incorrect sentence correct. So quick, the adjective, should be changed to the adverb quickly. Next question. Although Jason seems happy about moving to California, he admits that he will miss his friends in Minnesota. Here, the modifier happy is underlined. Now, is happy an adjective or an adverb? Happy is an adjective. It's the kind of word that you would normally use to modify or add information about a noun or a pronoun. A happy camper, for example. Happy is an adjective modifying the noun camper. Now, is an adjective or adverb correct in this particular sentence? What is being modified by the adjective happy? Well, let's look at the verb that's nearby. It says, although Jason seems happy about moving to California, the verb is seems. Now, is seems an action verb or a linking verb? Is it describing something that the subject Jason is doing, or rather something that the subject Jason is? Well, it's a linking verb. It's describing something that Jason is rather than something that Jason does. Jason seems happy means almost the same as Jason is happy. Seems is a linking verb, and remember, a linking verb would normally be followed by an adjective, not an adverb. So the adjective happy is correct in this sentence, and therefore the sentence is perfectly correct as written. The sentence contains a linking verb which should be followed by an adjective, and it is. So this sentence is correct. Next example. Because of her extreme nervousness, Soon Lee performed the sonata bad during her audition for the college orchestra. And the modifier bad is underlined. Once again, we have the adjective-adverb question to deal with. First of all, is the underlined modifier bad an adjective or an adverb? Well, as we saw in the lesson, badly would be the adverb form. Remember that in many cases in English, an adverb ends in ly, and you can often turn an adjective into an adverb simply by adding ly at the end. So in this case, the adverb is not being used. Instead, we have the adjective bad being used. Now, is the adjective correct in this particular part of the sentence, or should an adverb be used instead? Let's look at the context, and in particular, let's focus on the verb. It says, Soon Lee performed the sonata bad. What's the verb there? The verb is performed. The subject is Soon Lee. Now, is performed an action verb or a linking verb? Is it describing something that Soon Lee did or something that she was? It's describing something that Soon Lee did. Performing the sonata is an action. So performed is an action verb. And remember that an action verb needs to be followed by an adverb, not an adjective. So this sentence is wrong as written. The adjective bad is incorrect. Instead, the adverb badly should be used, and badly would modify the action verb performed. So to correct the sentence, you would want to make it read, because of her extreme nervousness, Soon Lee performed the sonata badly during her audition for the college orchestra. Next example. The team doctor decided that Mona was well enough to play in Saturday's championship game, and the modifier well is underlined. Remember that well can be used as either an adjective or an adverb, and that its meaning will vary depending on which way it's used. In this sentence, which way is the word well being used? Let's look at the context. We're told that Mona was well enough to play in Saturday's championship game. What's the nearby verb? The verb is was. And is was an action verb or a linking verb? Well, was is a linking verb. In fact, it's a form of the most common linking verb in English, the verb to be. What's being described here is not an action that Mona is taking, but rather a state of being, something that Mona was rather than something that Mona did. So was is a linking verb, and what follows a linking verb should be an adjective, not an adverb. All right then, if well is being used as an adjective, is it the correct word in this context? Remember that as an adjective, the word well means healthy. So the sentence is saying Mona was healthy enough to play in Saturday's championship game. Does that make sense? Of course, because we're being told that the team doctor made this decision. The doctor, of course, would be concerned with Mona's health, and therefore well makes sense. It's the correct word grammatically, because the adjective fits logically into the sentence, and it's the correct word in terms of its meaning, because health is what is being discussed here. So for this last example, the sentence is perfectly correct as written. So far, we've been talking about the use of single words as modifiers, namely adjectives and adverbs. Sometimes groups of words can be used as modifiers, specifically phrases and clauses. Now, if you've watched the program in this series that deals with sentence structure, then you're familiar with phrases and clauses. Both phrases and clauses are groups of words. The main difference between them is that a clause contains a subject and a verb. And a clause can be either an independent clause or a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence. Now, as we'll see in a moment, both phrases and subordinate clauses are often used as modifiers in sentences. In other words, they give more information about something else that appears in the sentence. In that sense, these phrases and clauses are being used very much like adjectives and adverbs. And there are a couple of special problems that can sometimes arise when phrases and clauses are used as modifiers. First, let's look at a couple of examples of how a phrase and a clause can be used as a modifier. Take a look at this sentence. Running to catch the bus, I tripped on my untied shoelace. Now, what's the main verb in this sentence? It's tripped. The subject is I, the pronoun. I tripped on my untied shoelace. That's the main action of the sentence. The sentence begins, however, with 5 words that are set off by a comma, and they form a separate phrase, running to catch the bus. Now, what's the function of this phrase in the sentence? What role does it play? Well, if you think about it, what this phrase does is it modifies or gives more information about something else in the sentence. Namely, it gives more information about I. What was I doing? Running to catch the bus. That entire phrase there tells something more about the pronoun I. It describes what I was doing at the time of the accident, of the tripping. So running to catch the bus is acting, the entire group of words is acting in a sense as an adjective. It's a modifying phrase, and the whole group of words refers to, modifies, or gives more information about I in the sentence. So this is an example of how a phrase in a sentence can act as a modifier. Very often, when a sentence begins with a group of words like this, set off by a comma, it's acting as a modifier. And as we'll see in a moment, it should be near to or next to whatever it's modifying. Take a look at this sentence for a somewhat different example. The food was spoiled because it had been left on the table overnight. Now, this sentence contains two different verbs. First, we have the food was spoiled. This is a clause unto itself because it contains a subject and a verb. The verb is was spoiled, a two-word verb phrase. The subject, food or the food. So the food was spoiled is a clause. It could even stand alone as a sentence. But then we have another clause. Because it had been left on the table overnight is also a clause. It also contains a subject and a verb. The verb is the phrase had been left, and the subject is the pronoun it. Because it had been left on the table overnight is a clause, but it can't stand alone as a sentence. That word at the beginning, because, turns it into a subordinate clause. Because is a subordinating conjunction, and when it begins a clause, the clause can't stand alone as a sentence. If you saw this standing as a sentence, you would say, that sounds incomplete. I don't understand what's being said. Because turns it into a subordinate clause. So we have a main clause, an independent clause, followed by a subordinate clause. A very common structure for a sentence. Now again, when you think about it, the subordinate clause, and this is usually the case, is acting as a modifier. It's giving more information about something that appears in the independent clause. Because it had been left on the table overnight, that all explains why the food was spoiled. Therefore, this subordinate clause is acting as a kind of adverb. It's giving more information about or modifying the verb was spoiled. So here we have an entire clause acting as an adverb, acting as a modifier. So in the two sentences we've just looked at, we've seen how groups of words can act as modifiers. In the first sentence, we saw a group of words acting as an adjective, modifying the pronoun I. In this sentence, we have a group of words, a clause, acting as an adverb, modifying the verb was spoiled. So now we can see how groups of words, phrases, and clauses can act as modifiers. Now, why does this pose problems for writing English sentences? It can create a problem if the modifying phrase or clause is not placed in the proper relationship to the rest of the sentence. And there are two basic problems to watch out for. Here they are. First, when a modifier is separated from the word or words it modifies, causing confusion, it is called a misplaced modifier. A modifying phrase or clause should always be placed as close as possible to the word or words it modifies. That way, it's obvious to the person reading the sentence exactly what idea is linked to what. When the link is not clear, when the two things are not placed close to one another, then confusion, even momentary confusion, arises, and the sentence is considered wrong. And then we have the problem of the misplaced modifier. Take a look at this sentence. Painted bright yellow, the decorator selected a new cabinet for the kitchen. Now this sentence begins with a modifying phrase, painted bright yellow. Very often, as we've seen, a modifying phrase appears at the beginning of the sentence, and it's usually set off by a comma from the rest of the sentence. Now, what immediately follows the modifying phrase should be the word or words that the modifying phrase refers to or modifies. In this case, we have painted bright yellow followed by the decorator. If you stop and think about it for a moment, it almost sounds as though the sentence is saying that the decorator was painted bright yellow. Of course, that's not the idea. A person would never be painted bright yellow. And so, after a few seconds of confusion, the reader immediately figures out what is really going on. The thing that's really painted bright yellow, of course, is the new cabinet that has been selected for the kitchen by the decorator. But there is a moment or two of confusion, and it's actually a little comic if you think about what the sentence seems to be saying. Painted bright yellow, the decorator selected a new cabinet for the kitchen. It doesn't really make sense, and it's a little bit confusing, causes the reader to pause just a second to get his or her bearings and figure out what's actually being said, and that's not the kind of effect you want your writing to have. Ideally, a sentence should be perfectly clear the first time through and not cause the reader to pause. This particular sentence violates the rule by separating the modifying phrase from the word that it modifies, and therefore we have a misplaced modifier. Now, how do you correct a misplaced modifier? The easiest and usually the best way to correct it is simply to move the modifying phrase or clause so that it is next to what it modifies. So to correct this sentence, we would want to move the words painted bright yellow and put them next to the cabinet. The sentence could then read, the decorator selected a new cabinet painted bright yellow for the kitchen. And that would be a simple, easy, and perfectly correct way of rewriting this sentence. So the normal solution for a misplaced modifier is simply to move the modifier so that it is next to what it's supposed to be modifying. A different kind of problem is caused and solved in a different way. When a modifier has no word or words in the sentence to modify, it is called a dangling modifier. In this kind of sentence, the connection has broken down altogether because we have a modifying phrase or clause that actually doesn't have any word or words in the sentence to link up to or to modify. And therefore, the confusion on the part of the reader is even greater. And a little more work has to be done in order to correct this kind of sentence, a sentence containing a dangling modifier. Here's an example. While driving to work yesterday morning, an accident delayed traffic on the highway. Okay, let's take a look at this sentence. After the comma, we have the main part of the sentence. An accident delayed traffic on the highway. We have the verb delayed, the subject accident, and that could stand alone as a sentence. What comes before the comma is a modifying phrase, which is designed to give more information, to add some detail about what's being described in the main part of the sentence, while driving to work yesterday morning. The problem is that that modifying phrase doesn't link up to any word or words in the rest of the sentence. Think about it for a moment. Who is being described in that modifying phrase? While driving to work yesterday morning, who? Who was driving to work yesterday morning? The rest of the sentence says, an accident delayed traffic on the highway. That leaves it totally unclear who was driving to work, who is being discussed here. And therefore, there's no real connection between the modifying phrase and whoever is supposed to be modified by it. In fact, the person being modified doesn't appear in the sentence. And that's why we call this a dangling modifier. It is a would-be modifier that doesn't have any word or words to modify. Solving the problem of a dangling modifier is a little more tricky than solving the misplaced modifier. A misplaced modifier can be fixed simply by moving it. A dangling modifier generally requires that you rewrite the sentence, and usually there's more than one good way of doing it. Here are two possible ways of fixing this particular sentence. One way would be to take the modifying phrase and turn it into a subordinate clause, adding a subject and a verb, and thereby making it much clearer what's being described. If you were to do that to this sentence, it might read as follows. While I was driving to work yesterday morning, an accident delayed traffic on the highway. Notice that we've now taken the modifying phrase, while driving to work yesterday morning, and turned it into a clause with the complete subject and verb, I was driving. While I was driving to work yesterday morning. Notice that it's no longer unclear who is being referred to in that phrase, driving to work yesterday morning. Now, it's obvious that I'm the one who is doing the driving. And therefore, turning this into a subordinate clause makes it perfectly clear and solves the problem of the dangling modifier. Another way of solving the problem would be as follows. Remember that the modifying phrase or clause should always be next to what it modifies. Therefore, what you could do with this sentence would be to keep the modifying phrase at the beginning of the sentence and just make sure that what immediately follows it explains who or what was doing the driving. In other words, make sure that right after the comma we put the word or words that are being modified by the modifying phrase. That would mean that right after the comma you'd want to have I, if I am the one doing the driving. And again, that requires a little bit of rewriting. The sentence might read, for example, as follows. While driving to work yesterday morning, I was delayed by an accident on the highway. Notice how we've solved the problem. We've kept the modifying phrase in place, but made sure that what follows immediately after it is I. And that makes it clear that I am the one being modified. I was the one who was driving to work yesterday morning. And then, of course, we've had to rewrite the clause a little bit to make it clear exactly what was going on. I was delayed is the way of rewriting that clause so that it contains the same meaning but begins with I. So the problem of the dangling modifier exists when you have a modifying phrase or clause that isn't connected logically to the rest of the sentence. And usually there's more than one way of fixing it. And in this case, you have at least two alternatives, and there probably are other acceptable ways of fixing it. The important thing is to make sure that when you have the rewritten sentence, that you read it through and make certain that any modifying phrases or clauses are right next to the word or words that they're intended to modify. That way the sentence will be logical, clear, and easy to read. Okay, we've provided an exercise in your study guide that will give you a chance to test your ability to recognize and fix sentences that contain misplaced and dangling modifiers. Try your hand at the exercise, and when you're done, come back to the program. Let's take a look at the first sentence. Having lost one of the most controversial elections in history, many expected Al Gore to run for president again in 2004. Does this sentence contain a misplaced or dangling modifier? Well, first, let's see if we can locate the modifying phrase or clause. As in many sentences, it appears at the beginning of the sentence, separated by a comma from the rest of the sentence. Having lost one of the most controversial elections in history. Perhaps you can even hear when you read that sentence that that whole long phrase there is describing someone, and it should be next to the person that it describes or modifies. Now, what comes immediately after the comma? Well, immediately after the comma we have the word many. It's a pronoun referring to many people. Now, is that correct? Having lost one of the most controversial elections in history, many expected Al Gore to run for president again in 2004. No, that's not correct, because what's right next to the modifying phrase is not the word that it is intended to modify. It is not the many people who lost one of the most controversial elections. The person who lost the controversial election was Al Gore. So for this sentence to be correct, that modifying phrase would need to be followed immediately by Al Gore, not by the pronoun many. Now, as with many of these kinds of sentences, there's more than one way to fix it. This is technically a misplaced modifier. The modifying phrase should be next to Al Gore. So one way to fix it would be to simply move the entire phrase next to Al Gore, in which case the sentence might read like this. Many expected Al Gore, having lost one of the most controversial elections in history, to run for president again in 2004. This is all right. It would be a perfectly correct way of fixing the sentence. It does put the modifying phrase right next to the word it's intended to modify, Al Gore. The only problem with it is that it's a little awkward to have such a long modifying phrase interrupting the sentence that way. So you might want to consider a different way of rewriting the sentence. You might, for example, want to rewrite the sentence so that the modifying phrase remains at the beginning of the sentence, but that Al Gore then follows immediately afterward, in which case the sentence might read something like this. Having lost one of the most controversial elections in history, Al Gore was expected by many to run for president again in 2004. Notice that we've had to rewrite the sentence somewhat to make Al Gore the subject of the passive verb was expected. You have your choice then of more than one way of rewriting this sentence. In either case, the problem of the misplaced modifier has been fixed by placing that modifying phrase next to the word or words that it's intended to modify, namely Al Gore. Next example. Distracted by the demands of my 2 children, the chicken in the oven burned. Here we have a dangling modifier. The sentence begins with a modifying phrase, distracted by the demands of my 2 children. Remember that what follows immediately should be the word or words that are being modified. In other words, who was distracted by the demands of my 2 children? Well, presumably that was me. I would normally be the one that my children would come to, but I don't follow the modifying phrase. Instead, the words, the chicken in the oven follows. It almost makes it sound as though the chicken was distracted by the demands of my 2 children, and I don't think that's the case. The chicken in the oven has other more serious problems. So the sentence suffers from a dangling modifier. The word I, in fact, doesn't appear anywhere in the sentence, and so there is nothing for the modifying phrase, distracted by the demands of my 2 children, to modify. So this sentence has to be significantly rewritten. And the most simple, best way to do it is probably to keep the modifying phrase where it is, but just rewrite what follows so that it begins with I, since I am the word that's intended to be modified. So the sentence might read something like this. Distracted by the demands of my 2 children, I burned the chicken in the oven. Or you could say, I let the chicken in the oven burn, whichever seems like a more appropriate way to write it to you. The important thing is that the modifying phrase, distracted by the demands of my 2 children, should be followed immediately by the word I. So that way the modifier won't dangle. Instead, it will be nicely connected to the word that it's intended to modify. Next example. When birds fly in the path of an airplane, they can produce dangerous and costly accidents. This sentence is perfectly correct as written. It begins with a subordinate clause, when birds fly in the path of an airplane. And that clause is acting as an adverb. It is modifying the verb can produce that appears in the second part of the sentence. It's explaining under what circumstances the birds can produce the dangerous and costly accidents. In this case, we have a modifying clause at the beginning of the sentence, which is quite close to the word or words that it's intended to modify. Therefore, the meaning is perfectly clear, and we don't have either a misplaced or dangling modifier. In fact, I don't know how you could possibly make that modifying clause any closer to the word or words that it modifies. So therefore, this sentence is perfectly correct and doesn't need to be changed. Next example. Hoping to make the space more sunny, Nancy's bedroom was expanded and fitted with a large skylight. Now here we have a slightly subtle dangling modifier problem. Again, the sentence begins with a modifying phrase, hoping to make the space more sunny, and what immediately follows should be the word or words being modified. In other words, who or what was hoping to make the space more sunny. Now you might be tempted to say this sentence is perfectly correct, because after all, Nancy follows hoping to make the space more sunny. And so it makes sense that Nancy, whose room this is, would be the one hoping to make the space more sunny. But here's the problem. What follows the modifying phrase isn't the word Nancy. Instead, it's Nancy's bedroom. Nancy's is technically in the possessive case, and that does make a difference. In fact, taken literally, this almost makes it sound as though Nancy's bedroom was the one that was hoping to make the space more sunny. And of course, a bedroom can't have hopes and feelings. What follows the modifying phrase should be Nancy in that form, not in the possessive form, which makes it incorrect and momentarily confusing. So you would need to rewrite this sentence so that what follows the modifying phrase would be the person who is hoping to make the space more sunny. presumably Nancy. And there's more than one way that you might rewrite the sentence, but one correct way to do it would be to make it read as follows. Hoping to make the space more sunny, Nancy expanded her bedroom and fitted it with a large skylight. That would correct the problem because it keeps the modifying phrase in place but follows it immediately with Nancy, which makes it clear who was doing the hoping. It puts the modifying phrase right next to the word it modifies. Next example. Swollen by a week of heavy rain, the grasslands on either side of the Missouri River were eventually flooded. Once again, we have an opening phrase which is intended to modify something else in the sentence. Unfortunately, in this case, we have a misplaced modifier. Swollen by a week of heavy rain describes who or what? Well, it doesn't describe the grasslands. They weren't swollen. It was the Missouri River that was swollen by a week of heavy rain. Swollen means to make bigger or fuller. And after a week of heavy rain, a river would indeed become swollen. It would become bigger and fuller with water, which is why it would eventually overflow its banks and flood the grasslands on either side. So that modifying phrase, swollen by a week of heavy rain, ought to be right next to the Missouri River. Now, since we have a misplaced modifier in this sentence, we could fix it by moving the entire modifying phrase to follow the words Missouri River. But a less awkward and easier to read sentence would probably be the result if we instead moved the words Missouri River to immediately follow the modifying phrase at the beginning of the sentence. The sentence could read something like this. Swollen by a week of heavy rain, the Missouri River eventually flooded the grasslands on either side. In this way, by leaving the modifying phrase where it is and moving the Missouri River to immediately follow the modifying phrase, we've made the relationship very clear and solved the misplaced modifier problem. Whenever you use a modifying phrase or clause in a sentence, always make sure that what's next to it is what you intend it to modify. Otherwise, you'll create at least momentary confusion for your reader and sometimes a rather comical effect. So reread the sentences you write and make sure that they're not guilty of misplaced or dangling modifiers. Now let's go back to one-word modifiers, adjectives and adverbs. Sometimes modifiers are used to compare two or more people, things, actions, or qualities. In fact, there are 3 degrees of comparison. These 3 degrees are known grammatically as the positive degree, the comparative degree, and the superlative degree. In this lesson, we'll provide you with the rules you need to know to form and use all 3 degrees of comparison correctly. First, the positive degree. The positive degree of an adjective or adverb makes no comparison. You might think of the positive degree of an adjective or adverb as being the normal way the adjective or adverb is used. Here are a couple of examples. A tall building. Here we have a phrase containing the adjective tall, modifying the noun building, and there's no comparison involved. So this is the positive degree of the adjective tall. A colorful landscape. Here we have the noun landscape modified by the adjective colorful. Again, there's no comparison involved, so this is the positive degree of the adjective colorful. She runs fast. In this short sentence, the verb runs is modified by the adverb fast. Again, there's no comparison, so this is the positive degree of the adverb fast. Notice, by the way, that this is one of the adverbs in English that doesn't happen to end in ly, so don't assume that every adverb ends that way. Finally, this example. She sings beautifully. In this short sentence, the verb sings is modified by the adverb beautifully. No comparison is involved, so this is simply the positive degree of the adverb beautifully. Next, the comparative degree. The comparative degree of an adjective or adverb compares 2 people, things, actions, or qualities. It's formed in one of two ways. It can be formed by adding the letters ER onto a one-syllable adjective or adverb. Or it can be formed by adding the word more in front of an adjective or adverb that is 3 syllables long or longer. Let's take a look at some examples. A taller building than this one. Now in this phrase, we're comparing two buildings, this one and another one, and we're using, therefore, the comparative form of the adjective tall. The adjective tall is a one-syllable word, and therefore we form the comparative form of the adjective by adding ER at the end. So the positive degree tall turns into the comparative degree taller, a taller building than this one. Another example, a more colorful landscape than any other. Now, in this phrase, again, we are creating the comparative degree of the adjective. The adjective colorful contains 3 syllables. It's a long adjective, and therefore we follow the second part of our rule. We turn it into the comparative degree by adding the word more in front, and we turn colorful into more colorful, a more colorful landscape than any other. Now, you may want to stop me and say, wait a moment, I thought you said the comparative degree was used when comparing two people, things, actions, or qualities. In this phrase, aren't we comparing more than two? A more colorful landscape than any other seems to refer to all the landscapes in the world. In a sense, you're right. The meaning of this phrase does refer to all the landscapes in the world, but grammatically, only two things are actually being compared in this phrase: this landscape and any other in the world. In other words, in effect, what we're doing in a logical and grammatical sense in this phrase is comparing this landscape one by one with each individual other landscape in the world. And therefore, grammatically, we consider this as comparing two and only two items, this landscape versus any other. So even though you're right, in a broader sense, we are talking about all the landscapes in the world, grammatically and logically, we're comparing them one at a time, and therefore this particular phrase would use the comparative degree of the adjective, which is used for comparing two things, and that's why more colorful is correct. Here's another example, this one using an adverb. She runs faster than I do. Here we've taken the one-syllable adverb fast and made it into the comparative degree by adding ER at the end, because two people are being compared, she and I. She runs faster would be the correct use of the comparative form of the adverb. And one more example. She sings more beautifully than her sister. Here again we have a comparison of two people, she and her sister. And we've taken the positive degree of the adverb beautifully and turned it into the comparative degree by adding more in front. Remember, we would use the word more in front of the adjective or adverb when it's 3 syllables long or longer, and beautifully is a long adverb, and therefore more beautifully is the correct way to form the comparative degree of the adverb. We've talked about the positive degree and the comparative degree. The third degree is the superlative degree. The superlative degree of an adjective or adverb compares 3 or more people, things, actions, or qualities. It is formed by adding EST to a one-syllable adjective or adverb, or by adding the word most in front of an adjective or adverb that is 3 syllables long or longer. Let's again look at some examples. The tallest building in town. Here we're comparing not just two buildings, but all the buildings in town, and presumably there are 3 or more, probably dozens of buildings in town. And therefore, rather than the comparative degree, we use the superlative degree, which is formed by adding EST to a one-syllable adjective. So we've taken the one-syllable adjective tall and turned it into tallest. The most colorful landscape in the state. How many landscapes are there in the state? Who knows, but there are dozens or hundreds, depending on how you define a landscape. In any case, there are certainly more than 2. So we want to use the superlative degree of the adjective colorful. Since colorful is 3 syllables or longer, we form the superlative degree by adding the word most in front of it, the most colorful landscape in the state. Now a couple of examples with adverbs. She runs fastest of all the members of the track team. It seems obvious that there is more than 2 members of the track team, and therefore we want the superlative degree of the adverb. Starting with a 1-syllable adverb fast, we turn it into the superlative degree by making it fastest, simply adding the letters est at the end of the 1-syllable adverb. And finally, of all the members of the chorus, she sings most beautifully. Again, we're dealing with a comparison of 3 or more individual people, and therefore we want the superlative degree of the adverb. Since we're dealing with an adverb that's 3 syllables long or longer, we form the superlative degree by adding the word most in front of the word. So we end up with, of all the members of the chorus, she sings most beautifully. Now, we've spoken about how to form the comparative and superlative degrees of adjectives and adverbs that are 1 syllable long or 3 syllables long and longer. You are probably wondering, what do we do with adjectives and adverbs that are 2 syllables long? Well, here's where it gets a little tricky. In fact, it varies. If an adjective or adverb is 2 syllables long, use your judgment and your ear to decide how to form the comparative and superlative forms. You can either add er and est if you want, or you can add the words more and most, depending on which sounds right. And in most cases, it will be fairly obvious which sounds better. Let me give you a couple of examples. Take the adjective hungry, a hungry man. How would you form the comparative and superlative forms of hungry? Well, you could add er, I think, to hungry and est to hungry to form the comparative and superlative degrees, and the word would sound just fine. A hungry man, this man is hungrier than that man. This man is the hungriest of all. I think that sounds fine. So here we have a 2-syllable adjective where the comparative and superlative degrees can be formed by adding er and est to the same word. On the other hand, take an adjective like gorgeous, a gorgeous day. How would you form the comparative and superlative degrees of that? Well, you could add er and est, but I think the result sounds a little awkward and is even a little difficult to pronounce. A gorgeous day, tomorrow will be even gorgeouser, and next week should be the gorgeousest of all. It's very hard to say that because of all the S sounds. And so the correct way to modify gorgeous and come up with the comparative and superlative degrees would be to add the extra word. Gorgeous, more gorgeous, most gorgeous. You can try this exercise with other 2-syllable adjectives and adverbs. Easy, for example, would probably be translated into the comparative and superlative degrees by adding er and est. Easy, easier, easiest. Quickly, on the other hand, sounds less awkward if you use more and most. Quickly, more quickly, most quickly. When you're dealing with a 2-syllable adjective or adverb, then, use your judgment, try reading aloud the phrase, and you can either use er, est, or more and most in forming the comparative and superlative forms. When in doubt, use more and most. Use the additional word, because that's never incorrect, and it will often be a little less awkward than adding er or est onto the positive degree of the adjective or adverb. Now, just to complicate your lives a little more, it's also true that in English, a few adjectives and adverbs have irregular comparative and superlative forms. That is, the comparative and superlative degrees are created not following any of the rules we've given so far. And you simply have to memorize the proper comparative and superlative degrees of these particular words. Here are the ones you need to know. Good is the positive form of the adjective. The comparative is better. The superlative is best. Bad is the positive form of the adjective. Worse is comparative. Worst is superlative. Many is the positive form of the adjective. More is the comparative, most is the superlative. Much is the positive form of the adjective, more is comparative, most is superlative. Well is the positive form of the adverb, better is comparative, best is superlative. Badly is the positive form of the adverb, worse is comparative, worst is superlative. In this lesson, we focused on the rules for creating the comparative and superlative degrees of adjectives and adverbs. Using these forms correctly can also be tricky in its own right, and we'll focus on some of the problems that arise in the next lesson. But first, turn to your study guide and try your hand at the exercise we provided to test the rules you've just learned. When you've finished, come back to this program, and we'll look at the exercise together. Now, in this exercise, we've provided a number of sentences, each of which has a blank space. And in the blank, a comparative or superlative adjective or adverb is required. We've provided at the end of the sentence, in parentheses, the positive form of the adjective or adverb. So your job is twofold. First, to decide whether the comparative or superlative degree is correct, and then to form it correctly and insert it into the blank space in the sentence. Let's see how well you did. First example. Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris began painting around the same time, but Picasso continued painting blank, then Gris. And the positive form of the adverb that we want appears at the end, long. So the first question is, do we want the comparative or superlative form of the adverb? And as you know, the distinction between comparative and superlative is based on whether we're comparing two things or more than two. Well, in this sentence, it's clear only two things are being compared, Picasso and Juan Gris. And therefore, the comparative form of the adverb would be correct, rather than the superlative. And how do you form the comparative form of the adverb long? Well, it's a one-syllable adverb, and therefore, you simply add the letters ER at the end to turn it into longer. And the sentence would read, Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris began painting around the same time, but Picasso continued painting longer than Gris. Next example. Of all the sopranos in the choir, Lisette sings blank. And the positive degree of the word is well. Now, in this case, do we want a comparative or superlative form of the adverb well? Once again, it's based on how many things or people are being compared. And in this case, it seems clear that more than two people are being compared. The sentence reads, of all the sopranos in the choir. And in a normal choir, you would certainly have more than two sopranos. If there were only two, the sentence would probably read differently. It might say something like, of the two sopranos in the choir, or compared to the other soprano in the choir, something that would make it clear there's only two people involved. So the sentence certainly makes it sound as though there are three or more sopranos involved, so therefore we want the superlative degree of the adverb well. And as you know, the adverb well is one of the irregular adverbs. It forms its comparative and superlative degrees irregularly rather than according to the usual rules. And the three forms of the adverb well are well, better, best. The superlative form is best, and the sentence should read, of all the sopranos in the choir, Lisette sings best. Next question. Although Nadia and Katya are both expert programmers, Katya is considered blank than her colleague. And the adjective that we want is talented. Okay, how many people are being compared here? Just two, Nadia and Katya. So we want the comparative form of the adjective. Now, how do we form the comparative form of the adjective talented? Here we're dealing with a three-syllable word, talented. You can hear that there are three separate sounds in that adjective. So to form the comparative degree, rather than adding ER at the end, we'll add the word more in front of the adjective. So the sentence correctly should read, although Nadia and Katya are both expert programmers, Katya is considered more talented than her colleague. Next sentence. The island of St. Martin boasts 36 beaches, and many visitors say that Orient Beach is the blank of them all. And the positive degree of the adjective is alluring. First, how many things are we comparing? Well, obviously more than two. In fact, the sentence tells us there are 36 beaches involved. So rather than the comparative degree, we want the superlative degree. Now, the adjective alluring contains how many syllables? 3, alluring. Therefore, we need to form the superlative degree by adding the word most in front. And the sentence should read, the island of St. Martin boasts 36 beaches, and many visitors say that Orient Beach is the most alluring of them all. Next sentence. No one feels blank about the mistake Carlos made than Carlos himself. And the positive degree of the adjective is bad. Now, do we want the comparative or superlative degree here? This is a little tricky. You might be tempted to say, we want the superlative degree because we're comparing Carlos to all the people in the world. Of all the people in the world, who feels the most bad? It's Carlos. So therefore, superlative degree is involved. But once again, this is the kind of sentence which, although in terms of its meaning, it may seem to be comparing Carlos to all the people in the world, grammatically and logically, only two people are really being compared. That is, Carlos and no one. No one feels a certain way about it, and Carlos feels even more bad. I'm fudging in order to avoid giving away the answer. But you see, we're comparing Carlos with no one, so that grammatically and logically, we're just comparing two people or two things. That's why the comparative degree is used in a sentence like this, as opposed to the superlative degree, even though in a sense it appears we're comparing more than two people. We're using the comparative degree of the adjective bad, and remember, bad is another one of those words that forms its comparative and superlative degree in an unusual or non-standard way. The correct comparative degree of bad is worse. So the sentence should read, no one feels worse about the mistake Carlos made than Carlos himself. Did you get all 5 of these questions right? Very good. Let's move on to our next lesson. Now, there are certain mistakes that people often make when using comparisons in sentences. In this lesson, we'll look at the 3 most common such mistakes and learn how to avoid them. First, avoid making a double comparison. A double comparison, what does that mean? Well, look at this example and then we'll discuss it. After dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more livelier melodies. Maybe you can hear that something has gone a little wrong with the comparison here. What exactly went wrong? Well, remember that there are 2 different ways of forming the comparative and superlative degrees. You can either add ER or EST at the end of the word, or put more and most at the beginning of the word. And generally, you choose between these 2 methods based on the length of the word. If the word is short, you would add ER or EST. If the word is long, you would use more and most. And with 2-syllable words, you could go either way depending on how the word sounds to you. Well, occasionally people get a little confused and end up using both methods. That is, they use ER and EST at the end of the word and also stick more and most in front of the word. And that's what the author of this sentence has done. Rather than choosing between the 2 methods for creating the comparative degree of the adjective lively, the author has simply chosen to use both methods, and that has created what we call a double comparison. After dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more livelier melodies. Now, what would be the correct way to write this sentence? Really, the author has 2 choices. Remember that when you have a 2-syllable adjective, lively, you have a choice of whether to use ER at the end of the word or more at the beginning of the word, depending on which sounds better to you. So the author could have written the sentence in either of 2 ways. The author could write, after dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more lively melodies. Or the author could write, after dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of livelier melodies. Either one is really correct. It's just a matter of personal preference. The only thing that's wrong is to use both methods and create a double comparison. Here's the second common type of mistake. Some adjectives are absolute and cannot be compared. This means that there are certain qualities that are considered to either exist or not exist, and therefore it's not considered appropriate or logical to deal with comparative or superlative degrees. Either you are or you aren't, and you can't be more or less. For example, some of the adjectives that are considered absolute are first, last, equal, and unique. Perhaps you can see why these would be considered absolute qualities, which can't really be compared. For example, first. If you are first in line, you're first in line. No one else could be more first than you, or the most first. Either you're first or you're not. Perhaps the adjective where we see this mistake most often made is the word unique. Literally, the word unique means one of a kind. If something or someone is unique, that means there's no one else, nothing else like them in the world. They are simply different from everything or anybody else. And any one thing that is unique would be just as unique as anything else. In a sense, of course, all people are unique, but you can't really compare different degrees of uniqueness. If there's only one in the world, then there's only one in the world, and something else can't be more unique or less unique than that. Either something is unique or it isn't. If it isn't unique, that means there's another match to it. If it is unique, it's one of a kind, and it's an absolute quality. Nonetheless, people often mistakenly use the comparative or superlative form of the adjective unique, thinking, I think, that the word unique really means something like unusual. So you might often see a sentence like this one. The architectural designs of Frank Gehry are the most unique in the world today. This is really wrong because it is creating the superlative degree of the adjective unique, which should be considered absolute and therefore not comparable. You could make this sentence correct by changing the word unique to a word like unusual or distinctive. So the sentence would be correct if it read, the architectural designs of Frank Gehry are the most unusual in the world today. You can see that this makes sense because there could be degrees of something being unusual. You could have one architect whose work is unusual, someone else who's even more unusual, and another person who's even more unusual than that. So unusual is different from unique, and it can be compared. Our third rule. Make sure that the items being compared are truly comparable. If not, reword as necessary. Now, there are a few ways that you can go wrong in terms of drawing comparisons between things. And probably the simplest way to explain this is by showing some examples and discussing them. You'll probably recognize some of these mistakes because they're very common. We all make them in our writing. And whenever you make a comparison, you need to think carefully about what you're comparing and how in order to avoid these mistakes. Here's our first example. The tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than the South Pacific. All right, the person who's writing this sentence is trying to compare two things, namely the tropical fish in the Caribbean and the tropical fish in the South Pacific. But notice the way the sentence is actually worded seems to be comparing things that can't directly be compared, because he's left out certain words. If you look closely at what the sentence actually says, it appears to be comparing the tropical fish found in the Caribbean with the South Pacific. The South Pacific, of course, being an ocean. So rather than comparing one group of fish with another group of fish, the author of this sentence, if you take it literally, seems to be comparing a group of fish with an ocean, two things that are not the same at all. Now, of course, we can figure out what the author means, so we don't literally become very confused by this. But again, there's that momentary hesitation. We have a vague feeling something's wrong here. The author's not saying exactly what he's really trying to say, and it is considered incorrect. So the author of this sentence would want to rewrite it in one of a couple of ways. One way would simply be to add in the words to make it clear what's being compared. So, for example, the sentence would be correct if it read, the tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than the fish found in the South Pacific. Now, it's clear that he's comparing two groups of fish. If you don't want to repeat the word fish, you can use a pronoun instead. And the sentence could then read, "The tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than those in the South Pacific." Now the pronoun those has been used so that the word fish doesn't have to be repeated. And that would also be a perfectly correct way of correcting the error. The problem with the original sentence is that it seems to compare fish with ocean, and that, of course, doesn't logically make sense. And it's one of the types of errors of comparability that you need to watch out for. Here's another subtle problem that perhaps creeps into your own writing. Our new customer service center will make your next visit to the store the easiest of all your past shopping experiences. Did you catch the error there, or do you have a vague sense as to what might be wrong? What are the things that are being compared in this sentence? Well, the person who wrote this sentence is trying to compare your next visit to the store with all your past shopping experiences. Well, that's fine, but notice that the way it's written, it makes it sound as though your next visit to the store is one of your past shopping experiences, because the sentence says your next visit to the store will be the easiest of all your past shopping experiences. The way the sentence is worded, it makes it sound as though your next visit is part of the group of your past shopping experiences. And of course that doesn't make sense. Your next visit can't also be a past experience. I think what the author is doing here is jumbling up a couple of different ideas, and that's why he has ended up writing a sentence that isn't really very logical. Here's a good way to correct this sentence. Our new customer service center will make your next visit to the store easier than all your past shopping experiences. By rewriting the sentence this way, the author is now making a clear comparison between your next visit and all your past shopping experiences. Rather than making the next visit sound like one of the past visits, he's simply saying the next visit will be easier than all those past ones. That, I think, is what the author was really trying to say, and just became a little confused in setting up the comparison. It's another example of the way it's easy to get a little tricked up when trying to make a logical comparison. Reread your comparisons and make sure that you've successfully compared the things you're trying to compare. One last example. Many historians consider Lincoln greater than any American president. Here we have another problem relating an individual to a group. What is the author of this sentence trying to compare? He's trying to compare Abraham Lincoln with all the other American presidents. But you notice what I just said, comparing Lincoln with all the other American presidents. After all, Lincoln, we know, was an American president. When we read this sentence, it actually sounds as though Lincoln was not an American president. Many historians consider Lincoln greater than any American president. Think about the group that's implied there. Any American president, that group would include Abraham Lincoln. If we take literally what the sentence says as it's now written, it sounds as though it's saying that historians consider Lincoln greater than all the presidents, including Lincoln. In other words, Lincoln is greater than himself. And obviously that's not logical or possible, nor is it what the author is trying to say. When you're comparing an individual to the other members of the group of which he's a member, you have to use the word other. So this sentence would be correct if it read, many historians consider Lincoln greater than any other American president. For the sake of logic, you need to use that word other when you're comparing a member of a group to all the other members of the group. As you can see, there's some subtle ways to get tripped up when you're trying to create a comparison. So read your sentences that contain comparisons carefully and make sure you haven't committed any of these basic errors. Okay, try your hand one more time at the exercise in the study guide, and then let's look at those questions together and see how well you've figured out how to avoid these problems with comparisons. Now, in these sentences, there's a comparison in each one, and only one is completely correct. The others all have an error of one kind or another, and your job is to locate the error and then figure out how to correct it. Let's see if you were able to do that. Start with the first example. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than any other scientific discovery. Here we have a subtle problem of comparing two things that aren't really comparable. Why is that? Well, let's see. What are the two things that are being compared in this sentence? First, we have the story of the development of anesthesia, and that is being compared to any other scientific discovery. Do you see what's wrong with this comparison? On the one hand, we have a story, and on the other hand, we have a scientific discovery. What's missing from the second part of the comparison is the idea of a story. What we're really trying to say, what the author is trying to say, is that one story is stranger than any other story. But the word story is necessary, otherwise you seem to be comparing the story with the discovery. And those are really two slightly different things. So the right way to state this same concept would be to say something like the following. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than the story of any other scientific discovery. Or if you don't want to repeat the word story, you can replace it with a pronoun and write the sentence this way. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than that of any other scientific discovery. Either way would be perfectly correct. The point is that you need to make the comparison between two comparable things, the story and other stories, as opposed to the story and the discovery, which are two incomparable, different things. Our next example is the sentence that happens to be perfectly correct. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg has the world's most impressive collection of paintings by Rembrandt. Here the Hermitage collection is being compared with all the other Rembrandt collections in the world. There are more than two, and so therefore the superlative form of the adjective impressive is correct, and there's no problem with comparability, there's no double comparison, and no adjective that is absolute has been mistakenly compared. So this sentence doesn't contain any errors, it's perfectly correct as written. Our next sentence does contain an error. The government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe. Here we have a problem because Switzerland is, after all, a government in Europe, or Switzerland is a country in Europe. By saying that the government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe, it seems to be saying, if you take it literally, that the government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe, including that of Switzerland, since Switzerland is one of those governments in Europe. Once again, remember that when you're comparing one member of a group with all the other members of the group, you have to use the word other. So this sentence would be correct if it read, the government of Switzerland is older than any other government in Europe. Next example. Both Sheryl Crow and Bjork are gifted songwriters, but the music of Bjork is more unique than that of Sheryl Crow. Well, we're comparing two things, and so therefore the comparative form of the adjective is correct. But there is a problem because we're trying to compare the adjective unique, which, as we've seen, is an absolute. Either something is unique or it isn't. There's really no such thing as more unique or less unique. I think the author of this sentence is probably trying to say something else about the music of Bjork, and therefore the sentence could be corrected by changing unique to some other adjective which is comparable. So, for example, the sentence would be perfectly correct if it were written like this. Both Sheryl Crow and Bjork are gifted songwriters, but the music of Bjork is more distinctive than that of Sheryl Crow. So that would be one way of correcting the sentence. You could use other adjectives instead, such as unusual, but unique can't be used in this comparative or superlative form. Next example. Generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the most saltiest on earth. Our problem here is the problem of the double comparison. Remember that when you have a two-syllable adjective, you have two different ways of forming the comparative and superlative forms. Now, here we are dealing with a two-syllable adjective, salty. So we could create the superlative form by using most salty or saltiest. Either one would be correct. Unfortunately, the author of this sentence has chosen to use both. And that's a problem. That's considered grammatically wrong to use the double comparison, to use both forms of the superlative degree. So the sentence could be corrected in either of two ways. Generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the most salty on earth, or generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the saltiest on earth. This concludes our program on how to use modifiers correctly. Now you're an expert in using adjectives and adverbs and in creating interesting comparisons. So you should be able to go out and sprinkle your writing with all kinds of lively, vivid, colorful, and interesting descriptions using these modifiers correctly. And you can do it without fear of making a grammatical error. Thanks for watching, and I'll look forward to speaking with you on other programs in the Video Aided Instruction English Grammar Series.